Hello and welcome. I'm Adam with Push the Envelope, the channel that gives you everything artificial intelligence and machine learning. Today we're going to be doing part 2 of our Python for Beginners series. In this episode, we're going to be focusing on what dictionaries, functions, and classes are and how we can use them. So without further ado, let's jump over to the Jupyter Notebook and we'll get started. Okay, as you can see, the Jupyter Notebook is up and running, and right off the bat, I have the GitHub link here. This is where you can download the templates that I'm using. I also have the solution in there. It's not necessary, but it may help with all of these headers and everything that I have. I've also written out the exercises. But you don't need it. You can actually just follow along what I'm doing here, and you'll be good to go. So let's go ahead and start. The first thing we're going to do is learn what a dictionary is, which is one of the more useful things in Python. So I'm just going to start by defining a dictionary. I'm literally just going to call it dictionary. Now, a dictionary is defined using the squiggly brackets. This is supposed to be an equal sign. And so what it's looking for is key and values. Dictionaries are created off of key and value pairs. So I'll show you what that means. I'm going to have my keys be integer numbers. And I'm going to associate that integer with the actual number spelled out. So 1 is going to be 1 spelled out. And then I'm just going to create 2. And we'll go one more for 3. And close that squiggly bracket. So, okay, so now we have a dictionary. Let me print it. And as you can see, 1, 1, it's the same thing we have up here. But what does this actually do? Well, if I print the dictionary at 1, now this is a little different than a list. If you remember when we print the list at 1, that's going to give us the second value in the list because it goes by indices, and indices start at 0. This is different. This is going to look for the key. So it's going to look for wherever the dictionary key is equal to 1. In this case, it's going to be here, and it's going to return the value. So it's going to return that spelled out. So run that, and you can see we have 1 spelled out. I can change it. I could say what's 3, and there you go. Now, if I want to add to that dictionary, I could say dictionary at 4 this time is going to be equal to 4 spelled out. And now if I print the dictionary, you can see 4 is now added to the end of it. So very convenient way of storing some data and doing a lot of referencing. I can show you another way to define a dictionary. It may be easier depending on your circumstance, but we can do it from using key and value lists. So I'm going to store all my keys in a list for 1, 2, and 3, and I'm going to store all my values in another list. And these are going to be all of the ones that spelled out. Okay, so now to define this, I'm just going to call this one number dict, and this is going to be dict. And now I have to do a zip because I want to combine individual key and value pairs. I'm going to pass in keys and pass in values. Now if I print this out, it should look like the original one, and it does. You can see it's just the keys associated with the values that we have here. Some other things that may be useful. I can print whatever your name of your dictionary is, and I could say I want to get all the key values, so I could say keys. If I print that out, it's going to print all of the keys in a list. I'm going to copy that last line twice, and I can also do the same thing with values. And I can do it with items as well. So values will give us, obviously, the values of the dictionary in a list. And items will give us the key and the value pairing for everything within the dictionary. So some useful things that you can do with it there. But that's pretty much it for dictionaries. We'll roll right into an exercise, just getting some experience using dictionaries. So what we're going to do is we have this table right here. And I want you to create a dictionary for each individual user. And within the dictionary, we're going to be storing the first, last, age, class, and GPA. So these right here, these row headers are going to be the keys for your dictionary. And all of the information is going to be the values. So take some time, try to build some dictionaries for each individual user, and then print out the information for those users by referencing the dictionary that you created. So pause the video here. And then we'll come back and I will walk through the solution with you. Okay, I'm assuming you paused it and we are ready to go through the solution. So I am going to do this by storing all of these as lists, individual lists. So I'm going to say keys are equal to first, last, age, class, and GPA. And I'm going to just go row by row. So first is going to be equal to Tom, Dante, Kim, Jada, Phil. Instead of sitting here and watching me type all this, I'm actually just going to copy because I already have all of this written out. So as you can see, I just stored each individual row, all the values as individual variables. Now what we're going to do is we're just going to use a for loop to put this together. So I'm going to save all of the dictionaries I create into a list. So I'm just going to make an empty list to store it in. And now I'm going to do a for loop. So for x in range, the length of, you can just pick one of them. So I'm going to say first. We are going to be creating that dictionary. So user dictionary is going to be equal to dict zip. Now we're going to be zipping the keys with a list. Now we do have to make the list, so we're going to put a bracket there for a new list. And in order to reference this, all we have to say is firsts at x, and this is going to be a list now. So x is going to give us, in this case, for the very first one is going to be 0. It's going to give us the very first value here, which is Tom. But we're going to do that for every single one. So lasts at x, ages at x, classes, and GPAs. And that is going to close the list. That is going to give us a dictionary for each user. And then I'm just going to do the append it to that list that we created. So user dics.append that dictionary that we just created. And I will print all of them to the screen so you can see what it looks like. Okay, so we have this list of all these dictionaries. The very first dictionary is this one right here. You can see the first name for the key was associated with his actual name, and all of them are there. So it works. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do another for loop, and I'm just going to go through each of these dictionaries and print out the line. So for user and user dictionaries. Now what this is going to do is it's going to store the dictionary. It's going to go dictionary by dictionary and store it as user. So I can just reference user to get all of these values. So if I print, and I'm going to use some formatting here. So I'm going to do some placeholders. So I'm going to have a string space another string. This is going to be first space last. We're going to pass these values in after. Is a. Now we're going to do age. Age is a integer, so we're going to do %d. And is a, whatever the age is, year old. Now we're going to do the class. The class is a string. So is a 18-year-old freshman with a GPA of, and now is where we pass the GPA. The GPA is a floating point. So if you just default to F, it's going to give you like 5 to 10 decimal places. I don't want that many. I just want maybe 2. So I'm going to say 1.2f. And this is just going to round it to 2 decimal places. And now what I'm going to do is close that quotation mark and do a % sign. Now I'm going to put this on another line because I don't want to run out of space. But we're going to be passing in all of those individual values now. So this is going to be user at first, user at last, at age, at class, and finally at GPA. Okay, and if you close that, run that. Okay, now we have all of our lines printed out in a nice little format here. First name, last name is a age, year old, class with a GPA of whatever the GPA is. So that's just one way that you can use a dictionary and then print whatever the contents of the dictionary are as well. So next we will move on to functions, and functions are maybe the most important thing and most useful thing within Python because they're very easy to do complex equations or computations or any sort of thing to your data, and then have it repeatable and be able to span across multiple things. So to define a function, we're going to say define, so def, and then you're going to need a function name. So just make up a function name. I'm going to do a simple add function, and I'm literally just going to call it add function. Now, we're going to be trying to say it's going to be returning us the sum of two integers. So I just need to pass in those two integers as input. So within this top section here, we're going to pass in the inputs. So these two are going to be the inputs, and add a colon after that. And now here's where we actually do whatever the function is. So I'm going to say number 3 is equal to num1 plus num2. And then to give an output for this function, we're going to say return num3. So this is taking num1 and num2 as inputs and then returning num3 as the result. To use it, you could say something like, let me just call it number sum is equal to add function. So just use the name followed by the parentheses. Now pass in your two input values. So I'm going to say 1 and 2. So 1 plus 2 should give us 3. Let me print number sum. And now we get the value 3. If I wanted to do something a little fancier, I could define another function to print the sum. And what we'll do is just print it like 1 plus 2 equals whatever the sum is for 3 for this case. So num1, num2, and num3 will be all of our inputs. Again, remember that colon. And what we're going to do is print. I'm going to use formatting again. So in this case, we're just going to stick to integers. So %d space plus another %d. So this is going to be number 1 plus number 2 followed by an equal sign equals number 3. And passing in num1, num2, and num3 into that will place those within these little placeholders we have here. So now if I print sum, now you notice here I had an output, so I need to have a variable to store that output. In this case, for printing, I don't have an output, so I don't want to add anything equal to whatever the function is. But I do need to pass all of these in. So 1, 2, and then number sum. And as you can see, we now have a line printed out. And I was talking about how it's repeatable before. Something I can do is I can just create a list of a whole bunch of different numbers. So I can say num1s are going to be equal to just some random values here. Maybe I'll do 5. And then num2s are going to be equal to, again, just some random values. And we could just do a for loop and iterate through this, passing into the function and then printing it out. So I didn't cover this in the last video, but one thing you do with for loops is I could say for num1 and num2, so with a comma there, in. Now, we used the zip function before in the dictionary. I'm going to do the same thing here. So zip num1s and num2s. And this is just a way to get multiple variables within the for loop instead of like referencing their actual index. If you zip it, it's just going to add the first value of num1s with the first value of num2s and then pass those in. So I'm going to tab this over. Our number sum, instead of passing 1 and 2, is just going to be num1 and num2. Down here for our print, again, same thing, num1 and num2. Now, I did keep these the same here. So if you look at the add function, we have num1, num2 up here in this add function. We have num1, num2. That does not matter. You can change the name to whatever. You don't have to keep these consistent within the functions. But let me go ahead, print that. As you can see, hopefully our math is right. It looks like so. But it just goes through and uses those functions repeatably, and we're able to add and print using that. Okay, so moving on to exercise 2. Basically, in the last one, we were printing out all the student information. The GPA was in decimal format, but what we really want is the letter grade. So just create a function to using the scale right here to convert these values in this list to their equivalent letter grade. So just define a list, create a function that converts it. You're going to take the whatever the raw GPA is as the input, and you're going to pass the letter grade as the output. Each of these scales, so for instance, anything that's equal to 3.67 all the way up until 4. So not including 4, but it is including this lower level. So C is equal to inclusively 2.0 all the way up to 2.33, but is not including 2.33. Hopefully that makes sense. These are just the lower bounds of it. But go ahead and make a function and then just print out what each of these were converted to. And go ahead and pause the video now, and we'll be back to do the solution. Okay, assuming you paused it, we will move on to what the solution is. So we're going to define a function. We're going to call it convert GPA. We'll just call it convert grade. And we're going to be passing in grade as our variable. So that's going to be this list right here. I'm just going to tab down a little bit. I'm just going to make a list with all those grades in it. So that's 2.6, 4.0, 1.7. I messed up here. 1.7, 3.1, 3.9, 1.1, 3.4, and 0.2. So those are going to be all of our grades there that we're going to be converting. And within this conversion, we're just going to be using a bunch of if-else statements. So if the grade is equal to 4.0, then we're going to be assigning it the letter A. And after this is going to be a bunch of elif statements. So if the grade is greater than equal to whatever this bottom limit is, so in this case 3.67, and the grade is less than whatever the one before it was, so 4.0, then the letter is going to be equal to A minus in this case. And we're just going to keep repeating this. So I'm going to copy this and just paste it a bunch of times. That'll give us a start here. So now we just keep going down the list. So it's going to be 3.33 to 3.67. That will give us a B plus. 3.00 to 3.33. That will give us a B. 2.67 up to 3 will give us a B minus. 2.33 up to 2.67 will give us a C plus. Just going to, again, copy some of these down again. 2 to 2.33, that will give us a C. 1.67 to 2 will give us a C minus. This is 1.33 to 1.67 will give us a D plus. Couple more here. A 1.0 to 1.33 will give us a D. 0.67 to 1 will give us a D minus, and the very last thing will be the F. So anything lower than that. So elif the grade is less than 0.67, the letter will be equal to F. Now I'm going to add an else in here, letter equal to error, just on the off chance that something is passed in that is not a actual GPA grade. But I know the list, so I know that won't be the case. What I can do is we could just do a for loop to go through this. So for grade in grades, our letter value is going to be equal to convert grade, and we're going to pass in grade print letter. Something is wrong here. 2.0 to 2.33 will give us a Let me look. I'm not actually sure what it is. Oh, I didn't return anything. So you have to make sure that you're returning something from your function. So return letter. And now if we print it, okay, now our letters are back, so you can see what each of those are. If I wanted to, I could say grade, comma, letter. You can see what the grade was and what the associated letter grade was for it. So again, functions, super useful, but we will move on to the last thing for this lesson, and that will be classes. So like a function, we need to define a class, but instead of define, we're just going to say class. And let's just make a patient class. Pretend this is a hospital or something. Now, we don't pass anything here for the patient. Even if we have inputs, that'll go later. So just define your class and whatever your class name you want it to be. Now we define some functions and variables within the patient class. So now is where we define the function. So define... in order to add values when you define it, you're going to use define init with 2 underscores here on both sides. Now, anytime you make a function within a class, you need to pass self because you need to reference itself as the thing that you're moving in. But now you can, here's where when you define it, here's all the variables that you're going to pass in. So I'm just going to pass in first, last, maybe some like hospital ID, the age, and the birthday of the patient. So now I can store these within the class as their own variables. So I could say self.first is equal to first, self.last is equal to last, self.id is equal to ID, same thing for age. And lastly, for birthday. Now, I passed all these in as variables. You don't have to pass them in as variables. If I come to the top, maybe I want to say the hospital name, we'll say South Medical or something along the lines of that. So I can pass, I can just define it straight in here. I can define it as a variable. I can even define it as the output of a function. But we're going to go with this for now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to define another function, maybe to just print all this out. So print patient info. Again, if you're defining a function within a class, you need to pass self. In this case, I don't need to pass all of this information because it's already stored in self. So that is one of the benefits of doing it. You can pass something in here, maybe that's not already in the class, but for this case, we already have everything. So I'm going to say print, just going to say name, and we're going to pass in just placeholders. So placeholders for the first and the last name, and you can pass those in. Now to reference those, you have to say self.first. We just defined that up here. So that's going to give us the first name. Self.last will give us the last name. And I'm just going to keep going through the list like that. Our ID, let's say, is an integer, so %d. And we're going to pass in self.id. Printing out maybe the hospital name. And that is going to be a string. And that was self.hospital_name. And maybe I'll do just the age. So age, that is going to be another integer. And that is self.age. I don't need to print everything out. I just want to show you how to use it. Okay, so now that we have this class, we're going to define a new instance of this class. So let me say patient 1 is going to be equal to patient. That's the name of our class up here. And then we're going to define it by using all of the variables that init is looking for. You don't have to pass in self. You don't want to pass in self. But we need all the others. So we need a first name, a last name, a ID, an age, and birthday. So let me just take some info from our next exercise. But Tom is the first name. Last name will be Smith. The age, I believe, is the ID is next. So let me just make up some random integers for an ID. Age will be 18, and birthday, let's say like 2 May. 2 May is going to be a string. Okay, and this is going to give us patient 1. So if I run that, you're not going to see anything until you define what you want to see. So if I say I want to print patient 1 dot first, it's going to grab the first parameter here, and it's going to print that out. So Tom. Cool thing about classes is I define patient 1. I can just copy this, and I can define patient 2 now. And maybe this is Phil Johnson, some other ID. Maybe he's 20 and his birthday is 3 August. So now when I print patient 2 dot first, I can see now I have a different name, but it's saved using the same class. We also define that function. So in order to call that function, I can say patient 1 dot whatever the function name is. So print patient info. Now it is a function, so you do need to pass in those parentheses after. I did spell print wrong, so let me fix that. But when we run this, you should be able to see. Let me print a blank space. But you can see it printed everything we have here in this function. And I can do, if I copy this, maybe print another space again just to separate everything. I can do the same thing for printing patient 2, and it'll have all of their data as well. So just cool things you can do with classes. Super useful, especially with things like storing user information or a whole bunch of stuff like patient information, all sorts of things. But we'll move to the exercise. So using that same table that we had before, we're just going to be storing these in classes now. And one thing I want is to add a function in the class in order to convert that GPA like we did before to the letter grade, and then add that as a variable into the class, and then print all of that out. So create a class for all of this information, create a function to convert the GPA to a letter grade, and then create a function to print all of the information for that user out to the screen. All of that will be within the class. So go ahead and try that, pause the video here, and then come back and we will work through how to actually do that. Okay, assuming you have attempted this, let's go ahead and work through the solution. So we're going to define a class. We're just going to call it student. Again, you don't pass anything parenthesis-wise here for the student because we're going to be saving that for the init function. So define that init. And here's where we pass self every single time. But we're going to be taking all of this in. So the first, the last, the age, class, and GPA. Now, as you can see, class is glowing green right here. That's because that is a variable name that we can't use. So I'm just going to call it like S class for student class. But what we're going to do is we're going to store all of these as variables. So self.first is equal to first. Self.last is equal to last. Age. Class, I'm going to call this S class. And the last one is GPA. Now, like I said before, I would also like the letter associated with that GPA. So one thing I can do in order to immediately call that function without having to actually call the function when I define it is I can say self dot, we'll just call it letter, is equal to convert GPA. Sorry, this is, let me backtrack. So this is going to be self dot convert GPA, and then we're going to be passing it self dot GPA. Now, self convert GPA is not defined. We're going to have to do that right now. But what it's doing is we're going to be passing that GPA into the conversion function, and then that function is going to output the letter. So let's define that right now. Convert GPA, and we're going to be passing it the grade. I don't have to sit here and write this because we already did it. So I'm going to go back up here when we define the function. I'm just going to take all of the meat within the function and come down here to the bottom. And we got to tab it over. But there we go. We have our function for converting the GPA. The init function will automatically take care of that for us, store it as letter. So now all we need to do is define the printing. So let's say def print student info, just like we did before. Always pass self. We're not going to pass any other variables because they're all saved, and so we can create that function. So I'm going to go back up to the top where I had this right here, this print function where we had first age, class, GPA, all that sort of stuff. We added it into a nice little output. So I'm going to just copy that, print it down here. So now I'm going to change the output a little bit though. So first, last is a blank year old, whatever the class is, with a GPA of whatever the GPA is. But now we also have a letter. So I'm going to, in parentheses, pass that letter, which is going to be a string. I can get rid of all of this that we're passing in because it's going to be a little different, but it's going to be self.first, self.last, self.age, self.sclass, self.gpa, and self.letter. That should take care of all of it. And that will be it for our class. Let me make sure I closed everything, and I did. So now we can just define one of these for our students. And what we're trying to do is what we did before with the dictionary. So again, I'm going to go up to what we did in the dictionary, where I have all of these different things. First, last, age, classes, and GPAs. Copy that, come down to the bottom because it's all the same information. Okay, I'm going to make a variable called students. It's just going to be an empty list that's going to store it because we're about to do a for loop in order to create an instance of this class for each student. So for x in range length of, pick one of them. I'm going to say first. So for each student, we're going to walk through and we're going to say student is equal to capital student. Again, capital student because that is what we called the class up here. If you called your class something different, use that as the name. But we will now define the class using everything that we passed into this init function. So first, last, age, class, GPA. Again, don't pass self because we're outside of the class. So this is going to be first at x, last at x, ages, classes, and GPAs. Okay, so that will define our class now. Now what we can do is we can print the student information. So dot print, what did I call it up here? It's right here, print student info. We are not passing anything in, but we do need those brackets. And then the last thing we're going to do is students.append student, and that's just going to keep a list of all of our classes. I do have a problem here. Okay, so let me see what I did. Okay, I kept saying it and I still missed it. Every time you define a function, you need to pass in self because it needs to be referencing itself for that. So make sure when you convert GPA, you add self before the grade. Go ahead and run that. Okay, now it's fixed. But what you can see is same thing as before. First, last is a year, year old, whatever the class is, with a GPA of whatever the GPA is. But now we also have the letter in parentheses after it. So just a cool way to use classes. You can store a lot of things within it, and it's all super repeatable when you want to define multiple things like students or users on a computer, or patients in a hospital, or many other things. It doesn't have to be people. That's just the easiest way to think of it. So for now, that's where I'm going to stop. I hope you guys got something out of this, and definitely stay tuned because I'm going to keep releasing more videos in this series to try to up your proficiency in Python and try to teach you more better ways of using it and different things that you can do with Python. So stay tuned. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you in the next video.